I've clicked the button.
Hello. And after an unexpected hiatus, allow us to welcome you back to Monarchism Unfiltered. After unexpected technical problems that prevented us from recording this episode the first time, here we are with a new setup and improved audio quality, at least on my part, for today to finally bring you the Renaissance episode.
Yeah, I mean, the feudalism episode really broke us.
In more ways than one. But so, the Renaissance. An age often seen as a precursor to the Enlightenment, even though that, whatever that means. An age where the ignorance or backwardness and what other expellatives you can pick for the Middle Ages was overcome for an era of enlightenment. The truth of the matter is, well, that's frankly a wrong way to put it. Neither were the medieval ages that backwards, nor was the Renaissance that forward-thinking. After all, if the Renaissance is to be considered a thing, it should be considered a thing on the basis that it was an age of apocalypticism. Pretty much everyone either believed the world was going to end or wanted it to end.
They were very into the end of the world. That was a big theme for them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it would be natural that one would be. I mean, you just survived the Black Plague. Not to mention that immediately after the Black Plague, there were tremendous social changes and political realignments going around. It does not seem like the best age to be alive.
Also, Great Western Schism, 100 Years' War.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're casting a very broad net on what is the Renaissance, but
yeah, the big things about the Renaissance can be seen as the breakdown of Monarchism was already there by the 12th century. An essential realignment of the political dynamics of the medieval ages. Now, the burghers, the literal, I suppose I should say bourgeoisie, but that's a specific thing as well. But no, burghers, as in the literal inhabitants of cities, started taking a political ascendancy during this period, or their ascendancy becomes more pronounced as opposed to what it was in the previous centuries. So you have this change on the internal dynamics of all states. You have, guilds were already a thing, but the Renaissance is the high point of guilds in terms of the social and political and economic force, especially in Italy, where we have accounts of nobles abdicating of their title in order to not only participate in Italian city-state politics, and B, to be able to join guilds. It was not so much that guilds prohibit the admission of nobles. It's more so that the condition of nobility precluded one from joining guilds in Renaissance Italy. But while we're talking about this, although Italy is often considered the centerpiece of the Renaissance, largely due to art, for lack of a better term, the Renaissance was a very global, European phenomenon, where you see a large amount of changes. In a good example of the changes we're already undergoing before the Renaissance but reached the high point is the Communal Revolution. Again, in Italy, this was very literal, revolts for cities to regain their quote-unquote lost rights that supposedly went back to Roman times, but in the majority of cases they didn't. But you also had a communal revolution in Iberia, both in Portugal and Spain, but this was again Arfueros, and it was not really revolutionary. It was actually 90%. It was nearly every time the monarch giving such rights to towns, typically with colonialist and settlement views. Though there were some exceptions where it was just given because, that town was actually economically important. Oh, come on, none of you want to add something?
Sorry, we're a bit out of the routine of making the thing.
That is
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. People were. There's a big overhaul in like how militaries worked. A large part of that was due to gunpowder, which was coming in hot. And so that meant that castles were not as important to warfare as they previously had been. And that, of course, chipped away at the power of the nobility. And also the way in which you supplied troops changed, and that there was a much, mercenaries became much more popular than they previously had been.
I mean, it's fun fact
As well
that
as I think you see more of a development of professional militaries, which, in many cases are kind of just stable mercenaries anyway,
Yeah,
or consistently
right.
employed mercenaries.
Yeah, and a new thing, and really the hallmark of a professional or mercenary army is that they're able to coup the state. No,
ha 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 ha.
I'm sorry. There's a dig at something Mikhail said last episode.
Still,
Guess you don't remember because it was 3 years ago.
pretty much. I mean, fun fact while we're talking about army reorganization, it was the development of gunpowder actually undercut a very big one. The army of the Papal States, I think slightly before the Borgia papacy, was reforming its army along Roman lines. And apparently the process was filled with hilarity because turns out by the Renaissance the average age of people just in general was such that it was difficult to find people short enough for military service because apparently the Papal States were taking all of their cues from De Re Militari. But yeah, if you go look up, you have like the big show of this was the shift towards paviseria infantry, which was big pavis shields, which were traditionally used with crossbowmen, but also being employed in a very Rome tower shield-esque way by the troops of the Borgia papacy. Of course, this was not to last because gunpowder.
So, what was the rationale? Like, why were they doing this? Was it just
A basically more militant popes, essentially, because the papal army was very outdated by the time those reforms started being in place. Like it was barely functional. Let's be realistic. And when you have the rest of the Italian city-states just employing mercenary troops, which I mean, let's not go discussing the effectiveness of condottieri just yet. But suffice to say, the popes decided that a reform was in hand, and they thought, let's bring back Rome. So and they based most of their stuff. I mean, this was a phenomenon that some condottieri armies exist, like the usage of the pavis shield in any other context other than like by crossbowmen, where it's big deal, but as like sword carrying infantry using pavises, essentially is an echo of this. That, as far as I understand, there was no attempt at equipment standardization in so much along Roman lines, though efforts to standardize equipment were carried out. I mean, during this time period, tremendous amounts of military reforms were carried out, like the Tercio, which really only achieved its final stage after the Renaissance, but the earliest parts of this started here. For example, the Portuguese Tercio, largely a copy of the Spanish one, of course, had basically our manpower. Portugal until that point was very much reliant on municipal militias to provide manpower. And what we did is that we started to slowly move from these municipal militias to basically municipal militias that get transformed into, or trained for lack of a better word. It's complicated here, we're using the word trained, but the shift towards the militias, the municipal militias, being more rigidly organized and trained along specific lines by central authorities rather than the municipium itself to begin this. In the Spanish case, I'm only really familiar with the organization of the tercios by the 16th century, which is a bit outside of the scope of this episode.
I'd say 16th century is very much like the heart of the scope of the episode.
What? No, yeah, I forgot. I was still thinking about like Renaissance as defined by art historians. So 14.
Yeah, but
so,
the 1500s are very much
oh, sorry.
art history
1600s.
Renaissance.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I meant 1600s. Jesus Christ, I'm really.
Yeah, that would be the 17th century, Chief.
Yeah, Jesus Christ. What a fool I made of myself.
No,
Yeah,
it's fine. It's easy to mistake to make.
I think it's what's sort of very interesting about the Renaissance, especially the I mean, we mentioned it earlier, this like apocalypticism, you know, and you see this as well with the kind of return to Roman military practices that you mentioned, that in many cases you see like a very aggressive attempt to imitate Roman styles and Roman art and all of these sort of things.
Roman Latin.
Like Latin reform. So like Latin was reformed along to be more in line with Cato's Latin, I believe. And you see a whole bunch of interesting, what you could call like almost reactionary moves that are often accompanied by this kind of extreme apocalypticism. So, if we revive Rome, then the world will end, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, because of the logic of the eschatological figure of the last Roman emperor.
Yeah, not just the last Roman emperor, but like just like 5 empires, these kinds of things, or a general idea that political unity will cause some kind of end of the world, and that's sort of quite interesting. I think it's sort of one element that's not really mentioned about the Renaissance, that there is this extreme tendency towards desire for the end of the world, even amongst those who we would know for art. So like, there's the bonfire of the vanities and these kinds of things, which,
if we discover all the land masses, that means the world will end.
Yeah, that was another quite common one. Like, that was if we hook up with Prester John, the world will end. Or, if everyone hears Jesus, then the world will end. And just a variety of ways. And I mean, this is quite interesting as well, because it's one of the few things about the Renaissance that is really distinctive to Europe, because you don't see this kind of apocalypticism in the Middle East, even though you do see sort of changes in art styles or religious expression, or the emergence of gunpowder empires, those kinds of things.
There was also the Council of Florence was a big one, where if you reunite the churches, that means the world will end shortly after.
In general, wasn't it also during the Renaissance that the talk of the third age of the spirit and like and again, apocalyptical mysticism also became a thing?
Yeah, no, there is this idea that there will be a third age of the spirit, at which point, the nature of the man's relationship to the church will change, and we're all going to become these monastics. And many people then identified this with series of growing movements, whether those be whatever the hell was going on in the 14th century, or the Hussites, or the Protestants, or any number of these things.
Yeah. I mean, again, like the theories of the third age of the spirit directly inspired many both proto and and church reformers. Well, not Protestants, Jesus Christ, two different things. I think like the Waldensians were inspired by by a similar logic, and the God, what was the other group? Could have sworn there was another group.
The Dulcinians.
Do you mean the spiritual Franciscans?
No, the spiritual Franciscans are. I mean, I guess the spiritual Franciscans would also be influenced by this. Now that you mention it.
Yeah, generally, I mean, it's very hard to keep track of all the movements, because there were so many, and they kept splitting, and then reuniting, and then being condemned and falling out and springing back up again, and there were sort of amazingly scandalous executions in which there were these Dulcinian saints, and there were saints recognized by the Catholic Church who were then claimed to be many things, or to have had then engaged in these sort of salubrious acts, and then it got very weird and strange.
Meanwhile, the average person just remembers Galileo Galilei, nice paintings, and not the complete apocalypticism of the age.
Also, and this is related in a not very direct way to the Renaissance, but I can remember, because I was hooked up to the net, that during the beginning of Obama's first term, there was much chatter on the internet that Obama had made a secret pact and was going to invoke the third age of the spirit.
That
was a thing, right? And like I remember there were these videos about like references to the third age in his speeches that were hidden, and but that's not related to anything, because the internet is a maddening nothing. But it's Sorry.
But that does check out, because like I was about to mention, if the listener wanted to know what was to live in the Renaissance, they merely need to cast their minds back to the year of our Lord 2012, when the big apocalypse scare was on the news back then.
Yeah, it was like that, but way, way bigger.
And for a much longer time.
Yeah. I mean, there have been subsequent bouts of apocalypticism. Like the English Civil War was, of course, huge for that stuff. There was also a massive wave of the end of the world Adventism in the 1840s in America. That was very big, and other places also had waves.
Wasn't that like the Great Awakening? Isn't like that phenomenon called that?
Yeah, there was a Great Awakening, and that led, among other things, to the formation of the Seventh-day Adventists, and even as far into the 19th century as the what are they called? The Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, still, one thing God damn it, we're really out of practice. Still, one thing to keep in mind amongst the Renaissance that I would like to emphasize is that, especially when compared to the medieval ages, the Renaissance is considered a more hygienic age. Truth on this matter is that it's exactly the opposite. In fact, the Renaissance was when Europe hit rock bottom in terms of hygiene, where people believed that you needed a protective layer of dirt on you at all times in order to avoid getting the plague. Where ancient, both Roman and medieval, the medieval ones were remnants of the Roman ones. Bathhouses were dismantled because they were believed to be unhygienic, and the highest example of this was the infamous, well, I suppose infamous no more, but shocking, I guess, in its uniqueness, the national haircut of Poland, the Polish platter, which
not platter, plat.
Plat. I mean, to give a description, dear listener, imagine never washing your hair to such a point where it becomes a solid mass. That was the Polish plat. But to say the least, there was similar things elsewhere. Well, not to the extreme of having a quote unquote national hairstyle like the Polish plat, but moves towards less hygiene were a thing. You see this, if memory serves, in some stuff like I can't remember exactly, but you see some moves towards less hygiene on part of the nobility. I think the clergy remain static in these affairs, but the nobility and to an extent the commoners, especially the burghers, also adopted this, in hindsight, absurd anti-hygienicist bend.
Yeah, but of course, what's very interesting is that this sort of trend in anti-hygiene is quite limited to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And Europe was already somewhat behind on that in the hygiene game, but the rest of they were somewhat behind. But by the end of the Renaissance, they were immensely behind, to the point that, like, going on into the 18th century, there are like these shocking encounters with other cultures where the Europeans are so unhygienic that many are quite shocked.
Yeah, but no, the best part is that the extreme of this anti-hygienicism that started by the Renaissance was in the creation of the UK plumbing system, where if, dear listener, you go look up old news clippings from the time, you will see people describe the hygienicist movement, those who wanted plumbing, as nothing but sophistries, charlatans, and people who want to defraud state money in making such useless things as a sewage system. Gotta love the Victorian era.
Yeah, that was not a good one.
Nope. But again, it was a trend that started with the Renaissance. I mean, other things that also started with the Renaissance, colonialism, basically. The colonial empire, the Portuguese colonial empire started very early, I think, 1453, with our taking of Ceuta, which, lesser known, but still painfully true, we took Ceuta because again, Portugal was a country that suffered from endemic famine throughout the vast majority of its existence. We took Ceuta because it had very, very abundant wheat fields. I think it was wheat fields. It was fertile. Predictably, and in true Portuguese fashion, throughout the centuries that we held Ceuta, we never made use of that. We were never able to control it well enough in order to make use of those fields. And so, like, in a pattern that would perpetuate itself throughout the history of the Portuguese Empire, we would try to achieve X, we would fail, and then we would retroactively make it so that the new objective was the original objective all along. Hence why people somehow today still believe that the Portuguese Empire, colonial empire, was founded to convert the heathens to Christianity. It was not the case. I mean, we only went to the east, to the to the Spice Islands, as they were called, because we genuinely believed that spices would cure the plague. Suffice to say, they do not cure the plague.
No. But it wasn't the dumbest idea people had about what could cure the plague.
Really? What was the dumbest?
Pretty much all of the other ones, the not washing, that one was actively harmful. Spices, while not proof against plague, do often contain, good antioxidants, which could help a little bit.
That's true. Hey, it's
not against plague, but
yeah.
Joint pain.
I mean, fair enough. I mean, people did die. Joint pain was a common occurrence back then, so common back then and now as well today, I guess.
The real plague is arthritis.
That's right.
That is true.
Yeah, also, if you're wondering why in the Renaissance episode that's very meandering, why we're not talking about art, that's because the Renaissance was an artistic dark age between the glories of the High Middle Ages and the Baroque. You heard it here.
That is definitely true. When did the Baroque period actually start? Like, what is the usual definition of the Baroque?
So the Baroque starts when they really get into using light and darkness as a theme in their work. So that's usually in somewhere around between 1590 and 1610 is the beginning of the Baroque period in art. Going sometimes as far as 1750.
That makes perfect sense to me. If we are to define the Renaissance artistically, it shall be as a dark age where nothing of quality was made. Still. God, I wanted to say...
I don't think we have too much else to say, sorry.
Oh yeah,
Mikos, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah. One last thing, since this is often brought up upon the Renaissance. This will be quick, don't you worry. The Galileo Galilei's trial, because that's always one that gets brought up during the Renaissance, church oppression and what have you. And the trial is often is often poorly portrayed, because what people forget about Galileo Galilei and Nicolas Copernicus, Nicolas Copernicus was an idiot. Galileo Galilei was an asshole of the highest order, for which there is no compare, truly.
I think it's unfair to call Copernicus an idiot.
When you have the math to prove your theory,
I know he had, but I think the proper term would be a fool.
Fair. I suppose. Yeah, in Portuguese, both are considered mutually exchangeable. So fair enough. Fool. But Nicolas Copernicus was his entire issue, and the reason why the theory didn't get approved back then was because when he was summoned before the papal court, I think the Inquisition wasn't yet a thing, or maybe it was. Either way, when he was summoned to court and he was asked to show proof of this, he even though we know for a fact he had the math to prove this, his answer was something to the effect of, God showed it to me in a dream. Suffice to say, stuff like that did not fly. On to Galileo Galilei. Basically...
but even despite him withholding his proofs, it wasn't until 60 years, by which time Copernicus was there, that much action was taken, because it so happened that Copernicus was personal friends with the Pope.
Yeah. No, but that's Copernicus's trial done and dusted. Galileo Galilei is almost a saga. His basically the whole shitstorm starts when he publishes a book published with the Pope's money and assent, in which he effectively calls the Pope a mental retard. I think the term was simplissimus or something along those cases, which at the time did mean effectively mental retard.
Yeah. So what happens is that in the book, because Galileo's most famous work is a dialogue between Galileo himself and the fictional character of Simplissimus, who then argues, and Simplissimus then argues, the Aristotelian model of physics, which is, at this time approved by the Church, which already gets controversial, but also in a letter, I believe, he did call the Pope an ass.
Yeah. And when he was brought to trial on this one, he was basically like, I don't remember the exact particularities, because I think like the Pope had lèse majesté, and he could have been literally trialed by violation of lèse majesté. But I think instead it was his theory that was legally disputed, and basically they asked for Galileo's mathematical proof. He literally didn't have any, and contrary to popular recognition, the papacy is effectively said, okay, you know what? For this, you can still teach your theory as long as you teach it just as that, a theory, and you not start running around proclaiming it to be the absolute truth. Galileo Galilei then leaves the court and immediately proceeds to preach his theory as the absolute truth, still having no mathematical proof for it. The papacy, seriously running out of patience at this point, summons him for another trial, and again, and the second trial, which again touches on the fact that he has no mathematical proof, and also that he, by virtue of his of shitty wording and arrogance on his part, was committing low-level heresy. And I mean, Galileo's second trial has been analyzed by modern experts, and most have pretty much side with the papacy, that he was that he got off very light on both accounts, in essence. But yeah, it was on the second trial where he was again told to shut up because he was essentially talking out of his ass, that he should recant on his theories, and that he did essentially, even though there was this whole myth of him during the trial under his breath saying, and yet the earth still moves. Really says. You were saying?
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a good place to conclude. Yeah. I mean, this has been Monarchism. Sorry. This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I am.
I've been Bronze.